Novia One Group is really a training organization that always asks itself, how do we make sense of reality? What conclusions can we draw, and how do we put this into practice? We're not so much about theory, but really around applying lessons, and we look for those lessons and we try and impart those. So with that in mind, I was looking at my own dismal failure to be happy during lockdown, and realized I was having a lot of challenges. And we also asked clients after the previous sessions what they would like to know about. And there were some questions coming like, well, what is the psychological impact of lockdown and how do we deal with it? So it seems to be a common theme that is running through people's minds. And Richard Ramplin and I, we've known each other for a number of years, and during lockdown, I've spoken to him regularly on the phone, and he's always in a very jovial, buoyant mood. And I was wondering, why on earth is he so cheerful when the rest of us are battling to deal with our newfound reality? And it transpires that Richard has been to the Navy as a submariner, and he's learned a certain set of skills and had a certain set of experiences that are standing him in very good stead in today's upside down crisis driven world. And so the idea was born, well, why don't we get him online to speak to you and talk about his experiences. So let me introduce Richard. Richard Ramplin, he's a professionally registered engineer with the South African Engineering Council of South Africa. He holds a master's in engineering management from UCT, and from the same institution, a honors degree in electrical as well as mechanical engineering, and is therefore highly qualified. He's put these qualifications to good use at several levels with mechanical engineering, as a business developer, as a systems designer, and a project manager. And he's worked on SA submarine systems, worked in heavy industry. He's got great expertise around fire systems, fire engineering, and he's extensively built HVAC or air conditioning units. And the air of which most of you would have breathed in at some point is sitting at the Cape Town International Airport, where he was, that was early on in his career, he built that. Currently, he's focusing on green engineering. Believe it or not, my personal opinion is that the climate crisis in air and global warming is a far greater threat to humanity than the one we're experiencing now. And so we're very grateful for his expertise there. He's redesigned a number of hospitals for green energy usage for provincial health departments throughout the country. And a landmark project of his was to design the seawater cooled air conditioning system for the Sido building at the V&A waterfront in Cape Town. So Richard's main focus was not always mechanical engineering. He, as I mentioned at the outset, he has a background as a Navy officer. He spent quite a bit of time as a submariner. So Richard, please, over to you, and tell us why you became a submariner, and in particular, what did your training really involve?
Fantastic introduction, much appreciated. Thanks for the opportunity to Novia One. I think it's a great platform that you guys have created over here, and I'm hoping that the participants are going to find something useful in the conversation this afternoon. I'm going to try to make the conversation as jovial as possible. Throw in a couple of anecdotes. You know, we don't want to sit here and just listen to boring old me the whole day. We also want to know what actually happens inside a bloody submarine. Okay, so I joined the Navy in 2000, straight out of school actually. The initial training that I got from the Navy was to go to Saldanha Bay. At Saldanha Bay, it's where you do a lot of the formative training, a lot of the introduction to the Navy. There's a lot of fitness training there as well. I think I don't recall a single person being on that training that we were on for the 9 months that didn't lose at least 15 kilograms. So as you can imagine, there's a bunch of running and a lot of swimming and a lot of carrying your body, actually, to be quite honest. graduated from Saldanha Bay after about a year of training, and then I went to Simonstown, and that's where life in the Navy really started getting interesting. Because when I got to Simonstown, that's where you need to decide what part of the Navy do you actually want to specialize in. And for me, it was a no-brainer, because immediately when you get into Simonstown, there's this beautiful big building there that's called the submarine accommodation, and it's got this massive submarine badge on it. And I was immediately taken by this. And then obviously there's all these stories about submariners, and you know, they always describe them as these mythical creatures, you know, that sort of get into this tin can and spends copious amounts of time at 300 meters underwater with death hanging above their head every second of the trip, you know. So it was very, very enticing to join. But at the same time, it was also quite difficult to get in. Because as a submariner, you need to be quite sharp. You know, you need to be on top of your game. I think if you can have a look at that photo that you currently have there, actually, that top left-hand corner, you'll see there's a whole bunch of valves over there. Now, the Daphne class submarine, the ones that I trained in, has actually got something similar to that, where there's just valves everywhere. I mean, in that particular picture, you probably see about 20 to maybe 25 valves. On board a Daphne submarine, there's something close to over 1,000 valves on the actual boat itself. And as a qualified submariner, you are required to know what each and every one of those valves does. The idea is that each and every submariner needs to be able to train on that boat and being able to know exactly what each one of those valves do, so that in case you ever hit any sort of emergency, it doesn't matter who the man on the spot is, he's able to handle the situation. So there's a lot of training that goes into it. There's a lot of drills, and there's a lot of honing of your, not just your skill set, but also your instincts that goes into becoming a submariner. If I can just maybe relate to another photo that we're showing there, it's quite interesting, is that bottom left-hand corner photo where you see that it looks like a female that's busy diving to the bottom. That is a submarine training. It almost looks like a little pool, but that thing is 10 meters deep. And what happens there is you actually train how to do your escape from the submarine itself. So that's a little escape training exercise that's busy taking in that photo over there. Yeah, so that sort of gives you a gist of the type of training that we needed to do as submariners and how one becomes a submariner. Yeah, so that's really the functional expertise that goes into becoming a submariner.
So, and then tell us about when you transitioned from just doing training exercises to doing the real thing. I think you also call them exercises, but you mentioned that you spent prolonged time underwater on exercises traveling around. Explain to us or describe to us how that felt like and what you did and what the constraints were.
Okay. Well, let's start with getting onto a submarine. You know, it's one of the most surreal experiences to actually travel inside a submarine, especially if you're doing it for the first time. I think for me, the most surreal moment was when you actually get inside the submarine for your first trip. Because if you can imagine, you're walking along Simonstown Harbor, you get inside the submarine, they close the hatch, but before they close the hatch, it'll be the last time you breathe fresh air. It'll be the last time you feel the wind against your face. It'll be the last time you get that salty sea smell. It'll be the last time you see water, and it'll also be the last time you see anybody else except the 64 other individuals that's going to be with you on board that boat. So it's a very surreal experience once they close that hatch and you actually start the trip. Because the next time they open the hatch, you could be anywhere. You know, you could be in another port, you could be in another city, and when you come out of that, when you climb out of that hatch, to then be in another city or another country or another port, it's a very surreal experience to live through all of that, because there's, you know, things have sort of carried on in the world without you, if I can put it that way. And a submarine is very different to a ship. So with the ship, when you typically travel, you know, you travel on top of the water and you can see where you're going, you can feel the waves, you can feel the boat swaying. In a submarine, as soon as you dive, as soon as you're 10 meters or more underneath the water, there's no swaying of the boat whatsoever. The boat actually feels like it's suspended in air. It feels like it's traveling. It's hardly moving. So inside, it's a very, very surreal experience when you climb out to then be in a completely different environment. So that's one of the things that it was a very cool experience, but also very surreal and sort of a little bit of anxiety driven once you actually climb out of the actual submarine. But
What
true
is the
story.
longest?
Yeah.
What is the longest you've been underwater for?
The longest we've traveled. The longest we've traveled is 3 months. The longest we've been underwater, I think it was a 5-day stint. But for me, it didn't really make a difference, to be quite honest with you, because there's very few individuals that actually climb out of the submarine while it's in motion. So you have your watch keepers, and your OC and your executive officer and those sort of guys. They will don. They will be able to climb outside and do watch keeping and all sorts of stuff like that. But for the rest of us, once you climb inside, you're inside, and you don't really get out or see much until they open the hatch when you berth somewhere else.
So describe a little bit the conditions inside the submarine. You said there's 65 people in total. It's all very cramped. What other kind of constraints and hardships did you have to endure?
In terms of the constraints, it's a heavily constrained environment. I mean, there's not a single square meter on that submarine that is not utilized functionally. One of the biggest constraints is obviously space and sleeping space. There's 65 individuals on board, so you got to find a place for these guys to live, right? So in and amongst all the systems and the valves and the compressors and the diesel engines and the pipes and the accumulators and all these other things, people have actually got to live and run this thing. So in front of the submarines is where most of us would be finding our sleeping accommodations. But how the sleeping accommodations work on submarines is very different. How we had to do it on the Daphne class submarine at the time was that for every 3 people that you have on board, you have a maximum of 2 beds, right? And how that typically works is that I'll use you and myself as an example. So if I'm on watch, you'd be sleeping, all right? Or you'd be spending time inside your bunk. Now, as soon as I come off watch, you then go on watch, and I then use your bunk. So I climb into your bed. So we basically utilize the same bed. So for every 1 guy that's awake, there's 2 guys that are sleeping, and those are the guys utilizing the bunks. That's why on a submarine they call it a hot bunk system, because there's always a hot body inside the bunk itself. So that's one of the first things that you've got to try and get used to is sharing your bunk with whoever else, by the way, might be sharing it, because it's not necessarily 2 or 3 of you that's sharing the same bunk. It could be up to 4 or 5 of you, depending which bunk is open at the time, right? And then the next thing is water. Water is it's a really big constraint on board a submarine. So much so that the only person that's allowed to shower is the chef. And even then, the chef is not allowed to shower every single day because of the water constraints that we have on board a boat. So the most that you're allowed, if you're lucky on a good day, is probably a glass of water to brush your teeth and wash your face. And that's the extent of the fresh water you get to utilize for washing purposes. Obviously, most of the water on board gets used for cooking and for drinking purposes. So there's very little washing physical washing that happens on board. So there's a lot of wet wipes washing and that sort of thing that happens on board in terms of the constraints that you have. So yeah, that's probably 2 of the biggest constraints that you would typically find on board a submarine. Now, the very first time I went on board a submarine, and this is a true story, is before you join the boat, there's a lot of talk around this this mythical glass of champagne that every submariner gets once they join the ship. And it's a pretty big deal. I mean, they talk about it in submarine school. They talk about it while you're doing your training. And then when you finally get to the boat, there's this massive anxiety that you have, that you're finally going to have, you're finally going to be joining the brotherhood by drinking this mythical glass of champagne at 300 meters under the water. So how they typically build it up is that sort of on the 3rd or the 4th day while you're traveling, you're now starting to get used to the traveling a little bit, and your thirst levels, especially for glasses of champagne, is at a maximum. So on about the 3rd or 4th day, the captain will take the boat down to 300 meters. The boys in forward accommodation they'll blindfold you and they'll carefully walk you over to the control center, which is the middle of the boat. They'll stick a champagne flute in your hand, to keep the whole thing authentic. And the captain will give a very nice speech about how you're being accepted into the submarine brotherhood and how it's a good thing for young submariners to join the team. And, there's a certain sense of pride that you're standing there with. But what you can't wait for is this glass of champagne that you now need to drink. And they fill up the flute, and the captain tells you, you know, have a sip, enjoy yourself, it's well earned. And when you finally take a mouthful of this, and when I say a mouthful, I mean, I really had a real mouthful, because I had a genuine gulp at this thing, because, you know, after about 3 or 4 days of drinking this brackish water, a glass of champagne is very welcome. And to this day, I can still taste the seaweed that was in that water, because what they put in the glass was freshly filtered seawater from exactly outside the submarine. And yeah, so true story there. It's one of the better anecdotes that I remembered from my initial time on the submarine. Yeah.